There was a pretty big thunderstorm going on this night. Nothing dangerous or anything, but enough to keep everyone inside for the rest of the day. I'm one of those people that enjoy rainy nights, or even storms. Something about it just makes me feel cozy and relaxed. Whenever there was a night like this, I'd always spend the night on the couch watching TV and listening to the rain. Luckily, I didn't have work the next day, and although it was already 8 p.m., I decided to make a hot cup of coffee and stay up as late as I could to enjoy the cozy night. I sat down and turned on a movie. It was only 20 minutes into the movie when my phone started ringing. I picked it up and looked at the number, but didn't recognize it. However, the area code was from this city. I answered just in case, always worried it might be something important, or someone I knew, but just didn't have their number saved.
Hello?
No one said anything.
Can I help you? Hello?
Still, no one spoke. Oddly, I could tell it wasn't a dead line though, like I could hear background noise. It was messy, and after thinking about it for a couple seconds, it kinda sounded like the storm or rain outside, so I knew someone was there, but they just weren't talking. Feeling weird, I hung up. I couldn't really think of any reason someone would call and say nothing. I figured it had to be a mistake or a scam of some kind, even though it wasn't the typical robot voice or whatever. I tossed my phone back on the end table and continued watching TV. I got pretty well into the movie, probably an hour through, when in just a matter of seconds, the storm outside got increasingly louder, like it really picked up. Thunder, lightning, and heavy rain. Then the TV and lights flickered. They quickly turned off, then right back on in a split second. I paused the movie and looked around, not sure what was happening. Then, not even 30 seconds later, the power went out. Suddenly, the entire house was silent, and the storm was twice as loud. Rain was flooding onto the roof and against the windows, and there was heavy, non-stop thunder for what felt like 5 whole minutes. The only light I had was a small candle that I basically never used. Obviously, I had my phone too, but I didn't want to waste its battery, especially since I didn't know how long this would last for. I lit the candle, then figured I'd just double-check the breaker box downstairs. I went down and saw the switch was loose. I flipped it back and forth, but it was completely dead. I went back upstairs and really had nothing to do but watch the storm out the window. I also noticed all the other houses down the entire street were dark as well, so it looked like it was a pretty bad power outage. My phone was running off of 5G data, so I checked if there was any information on the status, but there was nothing. I was probably standing there by the window for about 15 minutes, watching and listening to the storm, when, completely out of nowhere, I heard something from outside the house. I immediately recognized the sound. It was the gate to my backyard swinging open. That gate didn't have any sort of lock on it, but it never just swings open like that. Really, not having any ideas what it could have been, I walked to the back of the house and looked out the back door. Even through the darkness and the storm and everything, I could see the shadow of a man. They had clearly just come from the side the gate was on, but he was just standing in the rain in the middle of the backyard. Because I could really only see his outline, he just looked like a dark figure. I couldn't tell where he was looking. Like, was he looking toward the house at me, or was he facing away from the house? I didn't know what he was doing out there, but it gave me a bad feeling. I know I could have opened the door and yelled at him to leave my property, but I felt kinda nervous. I mean, if he was crazy enough to just be walking around outside in the middle of a massive storm like this, it wouldn't be far off to assume that he had a gun or something. I thought it was best to not confront them, so I just stayed by the door and watched him. They didn't move for an entire minute, until his arm slowly lifted up from his pocket and he put his hand by his head. I didn't know what he was doing, but I could see a small glowing light in his hand, and just when I realized what it was, my phone began ringing in the other room. It didn't take me all but 2 seconds to understand what was going on. This random guy outside my house was calling me. That's why I could hear the rain on the other end of the phone earlier when he wasn't saying anything. But that was an hour ago. Had he been out in the storm, standing outside my home the whole time? Freaking out, I hurried into the living room and grabbed my phone, confirming it was the same number. Then, without answering it, I went back to the door. The man was gone. This freaked me out. Why didn't I just stay by the door and keep an eye on him? I felt stupid. I didn't like standing by the door though, knowing he might be somewhere out there watching me, while I couldn't see him. I went back to the living room. I thought about calling the cops, but I really didn't know what to say. Like, someone called me twice and was outside my home, but I had no proof it was the same person, or that they were doing anything wrong aside from being in my backyard. Not too long later, my phone rang again. It made me jump, even though I was half expecting it. That's how freaked out I was. I declined the call, and only seconds later, a loud knock came from the front door. They called again, while continuing to knock on the door. These were heavy hits too, shaking the walls of the house. I turned my phone on silent, and embarrassingly, I kind of froze up and did nothing. I know how dumb that sounds, but I've never been in a situation like that before, and when you add in the storm and the power outage, it just made it all worse. I think it took 30 seconds, and for them to begin hitting the door even more aggressively, before I finally snapped out of it and called the police. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. They said an officer was heading over right away, and they were about 4 minutes from me. I continued to inform them of what I knew, and the man didn't let off hitting the door. This went on for the entire time that I was waiting for the cop to arrive. Finally, the operator said that they were on my street. A few moments later, I heard someone yelling. I hurried up to the window and just caught sight of the officer chasing him. They ran off into the storm, and I couldn't see anything after that. I think I waited 2 minutes before the officer came back empty-handed. The guy was able to get away. I was actually impressed by how much the police department tried to help me though. They did a pretty thorough investigation and seemed to take it seriously, probably because they actually saw and chased the guy. But the only real lead was the phone number, and it ended up being a dead end. I tried coming up with anyone who would be out to get me like this, but I had no idea. The case kind of died out, and since then, I've never gotten any calls from that number, or seen anything else. I don't remember exactly what year it was that this happened, but I've never really been able to shake the horror I felt that night. It's one of those things you assume would never happen to you, or that only happens in the movies, but being that naive only makes it 100 times more terrifying if you are unfortunate enough to experience something similar. I was young at the time, being in middle school, kind of at that age where I was starting to feel like I was growing up a bit. You know, feeling more like a man, I guess, which is silly to think about looking back. Anyway, it was summer, so most of my days were spent hanging out with my friends, either outside or gaming inside. This weekend was special though. My parents were taking a short road trip to a city 8 hours away to relive their honeymoon, or something like that. I didn't care too much about the details, because all I could think about was how excited I was to have the house to myself and invite my friends to sleep over with no rules to follow or anything. They left early Saturday morning, so when I woke up, they were already gone. I immediately texted my best friend, Finn. The only issue was that his parents definitely wouldn't let him over if they knew that there were no adults in the house. But with a little bit of lying, Finn was allowed to come over. Now, he wasn't going to be at my place until later in the day, like 6-ish, but being excited, I opened up the front windows so I could see when he got here later. However, when I did, I quickly noticed a man outside. The only reason I even cared was because he was strangely close to the house, like past the sidewalk and kind of near the garage. He had a very distinct look to him. Longish dark hair, patchy beard, and fairly tall and skinny. It made me feel uneasy, so I moved away from the window, not wanting to get spotted looking at him. A few minutes later, I quickly checked again, and he was gone. I didn't think it was anything worth mentioning. The rest of that day was chill. I was mostly in my room, just playing on my Xbox, until 6 when Finn finally made it. We grabbed some snacks from the kitchen, then went upstairs and pretty much locked ourselves in my room and played video games for 5 hours straight. It was about 11:30, and of course we were still playing Xbox, when Finn left the room to go to the bathroom. Only 30 seconds later though, he came back and asked if I heard that. I asked what, not having heard anything, but before Finn could answer, the whole house suddenly went dark. The TV, Xbox, lights, everything just shut off. I couldn't even see Finn standing in the doorway 5 feet from me. I combed the floor with my hands, trying to feel around for my phone, picking it up and turning on the flashlight. Both me and Finn were quiet for a second, I think just confused why the power had shut off so suddenly, but also I was listening for what sound Finn said he heard just a few moments before the blackout. Eventually, after hearing nothing and the power not coming back on, I asked again what he heard, but Finn said he wasn't really sure, maybe like a thump or a footstep on the floor below us. With the power shutting off though, we assumed it was probably just something to do with that, but we still didn't know why it shut off, and being younger and alone in the house, it was still a little unsettling. Knowing we kinda had to figure out what was going on, we went out into the hallway and down to the first floor. Once we left the room, we noticed we could hear the wind outside. It wasn't anything out of the usual, but enough to maybe consider that it could have caused a problem. Maybe it was us just grasping for something to blame though. Neither of us really knew what to do in this situation. Like, I knew there was an electrical box in the basement that could somehow test or turn the power back on, but I didn't know any specifics, and I was kinda nervous to try anything. Finn thought he might be able to figure it out though, so I showed him to the basement. Oddly, the door was already open. Rarely does anyone go down there because it was unfinished and nothing was there but some storage and random old unused stuff. However, with my parents going on a trip, I thought maybe they might have gone down to grab some suitcases or something. The basement door was kind of toward the back of the house, so I hadn't been over there that whole day. This just made the whole thing a bit more unsettling than it already was. We still had our phone flashlights on, so Finn led the way as we walked down the creaky wooden stairs and into the basement. It wasn't very big, kind of like a wide corridor with concrete walls and a few boxes and loose items stacked up along the wall. Obviously, it was extremely dark. Anything that wasn't directly in front of our flashlights was completely pitch black. We went over to the electrical box. The panel that covered it was already partially opened. Finn looked around at it, but I think now that he was down here, he was also just as nervous as I was about trying anything. The main, larger switch was the only one that was flipped to the opposite side from all the rest though. Of course, we didn't know what this meant, but after a bit of hesitation, he flipped it over. Immediately, there were a bunch of faint beeping sounds and random startup noises from all the appliances on the floor above us. The basement was still completely dark though, as we never even tried turning the lights on before going down there. There was only a single sliver of light shining down the staircase from the first floor. We started walking back down the corridor to get to the stairs, but just before we got there, A sudden shuffling sound came from the other side of the basement. Both of us stopped moving, and I shined my light in that direction. In the dark, someone was standing there. I could see their shape outlined in the light, and I immediately recognized their tall, skinny appearance and long, dark hair. He was standing sort of behind some boxes, which casted a shadow over his face, so I couldn't tell if we were making eye contact or not, or if he was sure that we saw him. I turned and booked it up the stairs. Finn followed close behind. I slammed the door behind us, and we just ran right out the front door. Both of us were understandably freaking out. We ran across the street, and I started a call with 911. It was pretty clear as we stood there, and all the other houses' lights were on, that the man in the basement had shut off the power. While on the phone, getting updates from the operator, we saw a figure move past one of the downstairs windows. Then, 15 seconds later, they moved past an upstairs window. I think it was the one to my parents' room that they were walking around in. But for the next couple minutes, we saw nothing else before police arrived. They went in, and nobody was there. He'd already left out one of the back windows. Of course, my parents were called, and there were a ton of questions, but ultimately, nothing came of it. There's so many horrifying things to think about when it comes to what happened that night, or could have happened, like how long that man had been watching the house for, or watching my family for. What exactly was he trying to do by breaking in and shutting off the power, then staying hidden in the basement? Thankfully, my parents were smart enough to move us out of that house soon after. Hopefully, we never have any more encounters with that man again. Every couple of months, I visit my off-grid cabin in the wilderness of Montana. It's very isolated, which was perfect, and the whole reason I bought the place. It's great for short vacations, to get away from everyone and just enjoy my time alone in the forests. This was during fall. I had a 5-day weekend off from work and chose to drive 3 hours north to my cabin, kind of on a whim. Since I didn't prepare much for it, the drive was a little bit exhausting as I hadn't gotten any extra sleep beforehand. I got to the cabin at about 7 p.m. The long, isolated dirt road through the forest that led to the cabin was a little hard to navigate with the sun down, but when I got to the front, I parked and unloaded my bag, quickly tossing it inside, then going around back to start up the generator. This whole cabin ran off of a gas generator, so the lights, outlets, and even the electric stovetop was powered by one small generator. I never used much power anyway, so it was always enough for me. I filled up the gas, cranked it up, and went inside, starting the wood stove and warming up. Up here in northern Montana, it gets pretty cold in fall. I think at night where my cabin was, it often dipped below 25 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the fall season. Winters are brutal, so I don't even try going to the cabin. Anyway, I only stayed up for an hour or so before going to bed. The next day, I spent cleaning, mostly dusting everything off and resealing some of the cracks in the cabin walls. Randomly, in the middle of the day though, I noticed an old truck coming down the dirt trail to the cabin. I could see them driving between the trees, but once they got closer, they stopped. They sat there for maybe 5 minutes, then turned around and left. I really didn't think too much about it, assuming they'd somehow made the wrong turn and likely had a cabin of their own somewhere nearby. At night, I think around 10, I felt like enjoying a bit of nature and started up a campfire on the front porch. This would give the wood stove more time to heat up the cabin as well before I'd go to bed. I grabbed some old fire starters I'd left behind from months ago and headed to the porch. I had this little fire pit out there, so I tossed a couple logs in it and lit it up. It was always so nice the first couple nights being at the cabin and just listening to the forest and calm, quiet nature sounds. However, I was only sitting outside for maybe 5 to 10 minutes before the outdoor porch light all of a sudden turned off. I looked back, seeing all the lights in the cabin were off as well. There was only the dim orange glow coming from the wood stove. It was then I realized the noisy generator wasn't being, well, noisy. It wasn't running anymore. Annoyed, I got up and walked around back. Sure enough, it was off. I cranked it a few times, trying to get it back on, but after 10 good tries at it, I gave up and kicked it out of frustration. I thought it was just an old generator doing what old generators do best, which is to break down and not work properly. But after coming to my senses and checking the gas, it was empty. What the hell? I had just filled it up with a whole canister when I got to the cabin last night. There was almost no chance it ran through it that quickly. I checked around the grass for any signs of a leak or something, but there wasn't. I was really confused. I honestly didn't know how it was possible, but I didn't have any extra, so I was going to be without power until at least tomorrow morning when I could drive into town and get more fuel. Despite the inconvenience, I knew it really wasn't too big of a deal. I had the wood stove to heat the place, and was going to bed soon anyway, so I didn't really need any lights or anything. I went back to the porch and sat down, trying to get calm and relaxed again to at least enjoy the rest of my night. But it only took me a few seconds to notice something out in the woods. A person, or at least something that resembled a person, sort of among all the trees, off to the right of the dirt trail. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but whatever I was seeing was so dark and still that I was unsure if it was a person or just a weird-looking shape, like a bush or something. After a few minutes, I kinda gave up on staring at it, since it wasn't moving at all, and went back to just resting and listening to the quiet night. But when I happened to glance back at the forest a minute later, I couldn't find it. I looked around for several more minutes, thinking I must have just lost track of exactly where it was, but still couldn't see it anywhere. Not gonna lie, that kinda put me on edge. I wouldn't consider myself a paranoid person, but that might have been one of the most unnerving things I'd experienced in a while. Obviously, if it was just a bush or whatever, it should still be right where I last saw it. It gave me goosebumps thinking about it. I didn't take my eyes off the forest for the next 30 minutes. The quiet ambiance that filled the forest around the cabin now felt eerie. I sensed that I wasn't alone, or that I was being watched. That, combined with the generator cutting out, something wasn't right. Then, I guess it probably would have been nearly 12 a.m. when I heard a sudden sound to my left, like a stick falling on the ground. Maybe from a tree, or maybe something else. I stared out into the dark in that direction, just kind of waiting to see if something moved. But after 30 seconds, I looked back toward the front of the cabin. My heart almost stopped. That figure was back, standing in the same spot as before. Then I noticed another, and another. There were maybe a dozen figures standing out between the trees, just 100 yards away. They were all standing motionless and quiet, covered by the dark, but definitely facing the cabin. My body went into flight mode, and I quickly got up and hurried inside the cabin. I stood behind the door for a minute, collecting my thoughts and debating whether or not to look out the window. Eventually, I gathered the courage to look. Every one of the figures were gone. The forest was empty. This almost made me more terrified than before, but I didn't have much time to think, because only moments later, I heard footsteps approaching the back of the cabin. I think I could distinctly hear 4 or 5 footsteps, but there definitely could have been more. I immediately shut the blinds on the front window. I listened to all these unknown people slowly walk around the cabin. They all stayed grouped up though, like they didn't surround the cabin or anything. At least it didn't sound like it. They walked up to the front, and I held my breath as I heard their boots thump on the wooden porch right outside the door. I genuinely thought this was it for me. I didn't dare try to look out. Disturbingly, whoever this group was outside my cabin, they weren't talking. Like, they made no noise at all aside from their footsteps. Yet they all moved in a coordinated way, like they knew what they were doing. What the hell was a group like this doing out in the middle of nowhere, in the woods? But as I stood there waiting, several minutes passed as I knew they were just standing right on the other side of the door, probably waiting for me to eventually try to leave or something. After 10 minutes passed, I finally decided, screw it, I'll try to take a look out the window. I quietly walked over and moved just a sliver of the blind, just so I could barely look through with one eye. The porch was empty. Nobody was out there. The whole group was gone, without ever having made a sound of them leaving. I didn't even bother grabbing anything but my car keys, then sprinted out of the cabin and got in my car, leaving those woods. I half expected the group to be waiting along the isolated dirt road. I mean, it was thin, and going through the dark forest at night, they easily could have blocked it off or something. But I was able to make it out, not seeing anyone else. I don't entirely know what I experienced at the cabin that night. That many people creeping around the forest at night and stalking me at my off-grid cabin, probably draining my generator, but then not doing anything. It just doesn't make any sense. What were they even trying to do? Unfortunately, I don't have any answers, but if anyone thinks they might know who this group was or what they were trying to do, I'm open to hearing some theories. I haven't been back to the cabin since, but considering I own the place, eventually I'll have to go back. Honestly, I'm terrified of what answers I might find.